The only thing we can do is leverage that power, because we do need to decarbonize fast. And to meet that challenge, we need to have the most powerful weapon in our arsenal, which is, labor power.
Which side are you on? Which side are you on?
All right, have we got Griscom in the Zoom?
Let's see here. We do, yes.
All right. So David Griscom is host of Left Reckoning and also recently a new contributor to Jacobin magazine. His recent article, Texas Shows the Pitfalls of Liberal Climate Politics. And we are really excited to break this down with him. David Griscom, welcome to the Valley Labor Report.
Hey, y'all. Always happy to be hanging out with y'all.
Always happy to have you. So, let's talk about this article. What was the impetus for this? What was the thing that spurred you to write this article?
Okay, well, I'll try to keep my head straight, because I will say the visuals are very distracting. In particular, your skinny tie is making it very difficult for me to think straight.
It's very woke tie.
And Adam's woke headphones.
I apologize about the headphones. It's the best we can do.
Oh, Lord. For me, obviously I've been following climate politics for a good while. I will admit that I think, like a lot of leftists, I always sort of figured it's like, let's advocate for the people to get empowered, implement it. And I hadn't thought too much about what that actually was going to look like. And over the past couple of years, I've started to get a little bit nervous about, a lot of the kind of dominant narratives on the green left. But for me, and this is not to come at AOC or anything, I went to a big Green New Deal rally here in Austin. And it was a really well done rally. They had, people from the Texas Climate Jobs Project there talking about, the need for union push in the movement. Hundreds of people were there. It was a really successful event. And AOC came up and she gave a really great speech. And then, though, towards the end, she started going a little bit off the cuff and started talking about how, we need to be learning from other systems, and how what we really need to be doing is maybe learning from the Puerto Rican model and decentralizing our grid and basically doing like residential solar, because like the system will never work for us. And for me, I hear that as like a socialist and somebody who wants to build big, powerful industrial and democratically controlled power in this country. My heart stopped a little bit because I realized that this is the kind of thinking that, like, even though, it might seem like, this is sort of moving the ball forward, this is the kind of, neoliberal hellscape that they already are trying to build. Here in Texas, we have one of the most decentralized systems. And, a few things that have been worrying me has been that, ever since we've seen these grid failures, we've seen this massive explosion in residential solar. And there's nothing necessarily wrong with that, right? I can understand as an individual, you say, I want to make sure I have power in moments when the grid fails me. Mm-hmm. But this is an individual solution to a collective problem. And, especially in a state like Texas, I do worry about, movements to try to decouple wealthy communities in particular from the state grid, leaving the rest of us with very expensive intermittent power and good, clean, beautiful, sweet power for, wealthy folks in the suburbs. So that was, what has sort of like started me really spending a lot of time reading and thinking and talking to excellent people, on the left, people like Matt Huber, reading people like Fred Stafford, talking to people like Lee Phillips, because I think that we really need to sort of reorient our climate politics towards labor, because I think that even though there's been overtures there, I don't think that commitment has been as serious and rooted as it needs to be.
Right. And that's, I think that is a really interesting, it's really interesting that Texas has begun implementing some of this decentralized stuff, and that has actually been the cause of a significant amount of issues over there in Texas, mm-hmm. right?
Yeah, so, Texas is not the only state that has basically, split up their power system and created, got a lot of deregulated their power industry. California and New York also have had like massive deregulation, but Texas, as is our nature, just sort of sprinted ahead of everybody else. And we have like an absolutely bizarro system here where it's effectively is a constant, auction house for power. So you do have competing power companies for a lot of people. Now, if you're in a city like Austin, we have one provider, and that's the public utility. But they're all on the same grid, which is always sort of bidding up and bidding down the price of electricity, which means in a crisis like the winter storm Uri, or even hell, last week we were getting messages saying, you need to keep your AC up at 7 to 8 degrees, don't wash your clothes, because there was a lot of worries that the power system was going to fail again then.
So it's not good when it's hot or cold.
Yeah, it doesn't work. And the price, effectively, it skyrockets. And, people are still dealing with the fallout of that. I mean, people got bills for literally thousands of dollars after the winter storm. So we have just like this hyper marketized grid here. And I mean, there's a few different threads we can get into. I also get frustrated when I talk about the grid. It's like everyone's favorite thing to talk about is the fact that Texas is not, plugged into the national grid. Certainly a problem and an issue. I'm not saying that it's not, but like that ends up dominating so much of the conversation because it is so uniquely Texan to be like, we're going to have our own grid and all that kind of stuff that people do miss sometimes. I think the real fundamental failure, which is that we have a hyper marketized grid. So, to give an example of why that's a problem, not only in the fact that people get incredibly high electricity bills when, when there's crisis moments, is also about weatherization. So after the failures after Winter Storm Uri, people were arguing, and as politics is wont to do now, it immediately devolves into a culture war. Right wing is blaming the Green New Deal and wind and solar, which was absolute BS. And, liberals and the lefts were noting that, no, it was actually natural gas pipelines that failed. And that's all well and good and true. But you need to do a little bit more investigation to realize why they failed. It's not that the owners of those pipelines were stupid, right? And they just never thought that it was going to get cold. No, they knew. They have had models for a long time that said, we will, rarely, but every once in a while get these storms that get cold enough and are cold long enough that some of these pipelines will fail. But they made the financial decision that it will cost them more money to weatherize those systems than they would gain from doing so. And if your pipeline actually is successful and doesn't fail at that moment, it's like holding a lottery ticket. It's like one of the quotes one of these providers, had, which is like they made incredible amounts of money, and just politically, like everyone knows where Greg Abbott and the Texas GOP sort of stands on this. But just to put some numbers on it, after the failure, when it became very clear that Abbott wasn't really going to do any kind of significant reforms or pushing on this, he got $1 million in a week. $11 million, Lord, I don't want to understate that. $11 million from, private power corporations. So, there's like fundamental issues to this grid. And the main problem is that has this responsibility not to provide power. That's just like a unintended consequence, frankly, for a lot of these people. It's to make profit. And that is a desire that oftentimes goes against the needs of the people in the sense of like having power that doesn't go off, or the needs of the people of making sure that they can afford their electricity bills.
Right. And, how is it that what has Texans' response to this been with the, the obvious conflict of interest that these people have had, and the obvious dereliction of duty that these private owners of this decentralized power sources have had?
I mean, politically, not too much. So they did pass a bill requiring these providers to weatherize their natural gas pipelines. But it has no enforcement mechanism, and like the date that they need to do that is so off in the future. It's effectively toothless symbolic stuff. I mean, Beto and the Texas Democrats, make a big deal about how just hitting Abbott and the Republican Party on the fact that they're responsible, for the failures, which I think is certainly true because they created that system, and they uphold that system and they protect that system. But there hasn't been, at least from my perspective, like enough of hitting on to like what we need to be doing. And like what we really need to be doing is looking seriously at our power system and taking most of these things back under public control. If we want to be able to provide people electricity. And like, this is something that Matt Huber notes, people should definitely be reading if they haven't already, is that like, if like the ecological movement's plan is to effectively electrify everything, right? To move off of fossil fuels for transportation, to get rid of gas ranges in your home, things like that, then we really need to start taking seriously the question of energy production and power production, and trying to wrestle that away from private interests. Because if our plan is to basically set up everything on needing electricity, then it's going to be very important as to where that electricity is coming from and who owns that. So there's been that, and there's also been, really sustained movements like the Texas Climate Jobs Project, which is an offshoot of the AFL-CIO here, to really start pushing, kind of Green New Deal policies with the focus on labor. But I think, I think they're doing great work, but it's like, this is one of those kind of, sounding the alarm to like the left, is that like, this is a call that needs to be answered. And I'd love to talk a little bit about what's going on in the oil industry in a second, because I think that's a really important bit here. That's where I was going to go next, because there's a call that needs to be answered about a labor-led, climate transition, but also there's a call that needs to be answered for workers who are being abused right now in the oil industry, and they need to be and they need to be the labor leading the climate transition. And so there are multiple ways that we can begin making these subset of workers, making their lives better, but using the making of their lives better to make everybody's life better by leading by putting them at the front of this climate transition. So talk to us about the attacks that oil workers are under in Texas right now. I mean, it's been sustained, protracted warfare, and I'll just say up at the top that one of the things that is tough with doing labor organizing in that industry is that there is this kind of ideology that like it's a boom and bust cycle. You're a tough guy and like you have to ride the waves when they're going, and hunker down when they're not, right? And obviously that's BS, because these companies make incredible amounts of profit, but that's just like a hurdle that's worth remembering here. But there's two stories here. It's the COVID pandemic and how that affected the industry, and then what's happening today. So I bring up the COVID pandemic, one, because it has massive effects on the oil industry today. But two, it actually was a bit of a preview of like a post-oil future, or like a future where like the market for oil is not as strong. And what ended up happening? Conservative estimate probably, but over 60,000 oil and gas jobs were lost. Vast majority of those were people who work in the oil fields or produce the machinery needed for extraction, et cetera. Like these are the people who are like doing the actual labor of it, not folks, hanging out in Houston and Dallas. And while this is happening, while all these people are losing their jobs, being thrown into this absolute failure, by the way, of like government policy and helping out workers in the COVID pandemic, the oil and gas industry was pocketing billions and billions of dollars in tax handouts. National Oil Varco received $591 million in tax benefits, and they fired 22% of their workforce despite getting all these kind of benefits. And by the way, I just wanted to note here, this is one of those things where I really appreciate my editor. He made the piece really clean and concise. But like I had 10 other ones. Like I did not note them because they were like the exception. It was like that was the rule, frankly. But not only are you seeing? Did you see that effectively? Like once times got hard for the oil industry, the first people who got punished, the first people who felt the brunt of it were workers. You also have seen a really frightening example in. Like today with high gas prices, and luckily it seems like they're coming down a bit. But, obviously, the Russian invasion of Ukraine plays a big role, supply chain issues, but also the fact that they fired a bunch of their workforce and they can't replace those people, plays a huge part in it. And two, this is just like a thing to remember, like when you're coming up against the oil industry, is that this is an entrenched, powerful industry that has a lot of capital behind it. And, these guys don't just write them checks, out of like the sweetness of their heart. They expect to get a return on it. And what happened when the oil and gas industry was getting all these profits from high gas prices over the past 6 months? They took that money and they paid off shareholders in the form of dividends. They didn't invest in production. So like, drop the climate change stuff for a second. We do have a society in this country that still runs on, oil. So we need that. Like, it's socially necessary at this moment in time for us to have affordable gasoline so that people can get to work and live their lives, and, food gets on the shelves, et cetera. Right. So like, this is a moment where like, a very clear moment of where you can see like the private industry is just absolutely failing. One, it's failing over, the question of climate change, but two, here, this is something that like we need in this current moment, and they're unable to produce it because they're much more interested in shoring up their financial position. So the next time that there's a downturn, they will get, people know that they'll get paid on the other side of it. So all that's going on, in Texas. And then I also noted, if that's all, not depressing enough, there's been a protracted war on unions in Texas, most notably in Beaumont, which I believe y'all talked about on the show. USW, excuse me, someone's calling me. Oh
no, you're fine.
USW, a local 243, went on experienced a 10-month lockout. And it was extremely devastating to the union. They ended up having to take effectively a very, very bad deal because ExxonMobil has sort of recognized that they can sit these things out and they can sort of weaken and negotiate down union contracts in the industry. There was a really big decertification campaign, which they barely eked out a victory. Undoubtedly, by the way, I know we should say allegedly or whatever, but as to be truthful, but undoubtedly, ExxonMobil is playing a role in trying to push these decertification campaigns, and that's just one example. It's happening all across the state. So, to go from that's the picture of Texas right now in that industry. It's very worrying, especially if you are somebody who believes in something like a just transition or like a Bernie Sanders style like Green New Deal policy. Key plank of that was getting buy-in and leadership from the union movement. And what we're seeing right now is all those workers are under assault, and their position is being weakened. And this is a moment when we really need to be showing up for them today. And I just wanted to note, like, this is something that is, I think, really important, particularly for the left and like the socialist DSA left, is that, I remember when Bernie Sanders came out with his Green New Deal policy, and reading it through and just being absolutely ecstatic because I thought it was phenomenal. And I thought that particularly the just transition was a phenomenal policy. And it is. And it's something that we should uphold and push. But over the past couple of years, especially post, Bernie 2020, I've oftentimes felt where people on like the environmental left just say, well, we support just transition. Right. And like, that's the closing of the book on the issue. And it's like, well, no, the just transition has to be an actual commitment. And, I was talking to a friend, Ryan Pollack, who's IBEW, a lead organizer here in Austin. And I think
we met him at Labor Notes, actually.
He's a good dude, a very good dude. I'm happy to hear that. But he said, it's not enough for people to say that this is what could happen, that this is going to be here in the future. It's got to be tangible or else nobody's going to believe you. And like, that's like from like the labor politics to the climate politics. This is just a general point that I think that our side needs to wrap our heads around a bit too, is that, it's not enough just to have like good policies and the right, printout on the issues. You have to convince people that this is something that one can happen and that you can deliver for them. And I think that the way you open up that door is showing up for them in these very, very clear fights where the stakes are clear as day, especially for anybody who claims to be a unionist or or a socialist or a progressive, et cetera.
Well, now, so all of these attacks on union workers, on oil workers and union workers who are oil workers, it reminds me of the months long anti-Hillary campaign from the right when she came out with her comments saying that we're going to put coal miners out of jobs. And you know, all of this posturing for coal miners by the right, saying that we're going to protect you, we're going to protect your jobs and your way of life and all this stuff. And so I can only imagine that you've got a clip ready for us right now of Greg Abbott and all these other Texas Republicans standing up for these oil workers and these oil workers who are unionists, right?
I mean, that's the real irony of all of this, is that, you know, when it comes to actually protecting their wages and, you know, protecting their unions and all of that, like, you get crickets from the GOP. And I think that it's worthwhile to point out the hypocrisy. But then the point is that, like, well, then it's an easy game for us. If we don't have to out-message the Republicans, we can be doing that. And the problem is that, you know, I think that, like, there's a lot of really dedicated people in the movement, but it's not centralized at this moment. You get what I mean? Like, there's just like a lot of different interests out there and people advocating for a Green New Deal, for climate change policies. And, you know, what you get more than anything is people pointing to work in the renewable industry. And I don't think I need to, you know, break it down too much for y'all, but that is not a good industry right now for workers. It's highly ununionized. They don't pay very well. And also, compared to a lot of other power production systems, like, for example, nuclear, it's not permanent in the terms of in the case of solar in particular, because you just go in there and you install the panel and then you roll out. So, you know, a lot of those guys who might do that or might be asked to do that, even if they are maybe union workers doing something on the side or something like that, you know, they're being asked to drive like 3-4 hours to do, you know, 2 days work, and that's sort of it, right? It's not like a locally rooted industry. And that doesn't mean that, like, you know, the technology is like dirty or shouldn't be pursued, but there is this kind of like, oh, we have a halo because it's, you know, renewable energy. And yeah, you know, so if you're a guy who's working, you know, in oil and gas, which again, I also want to remind people too, not to valorize it too much. It does pay, you know, pretty well for some folks, but it's rife with, you know, serious workers violations. It's extremely insecure work for a lot of people. It's extremely dangerous. And like, that system needs to be improved dramatically. But like, you can't tell somebody who's been making good money doing that kind of work, you know, to start working $18 an hour jobs doing, you know, residential solar as a solution.
Right. And, you know, you're talking about it from a worker's angle, and that's really important. And I think that if I'm remembering right, Energy Alabama, an on and off sponsor of the program, is an Alabama renewable nonprofit, and they have done some work on exposing some solar contractors.
Good.
You know, bad labor practices, which we're very appreciative of them for. They've donated to the Mine Workers Strike Fund.
Yeah, so
they were able to get
here for the miners.
Yes, and they've been able to get actually the Sierra Club to also make a donation to the Mine Workers Strike Fund.
Wow.
So the folks at Energy Alabama love them, appreciate them, and think that they're not only is their heart in the right place, but I think that they're going in a good direction. But you're talking about this. In the article, the model for building green power also relies heavily on tax credits for residential and also commercial solar, pulling money out of public coffers and directing them to capitalists. And as Matt Huber and Fred Stafford argue, this creates an absurd choice. Either public ownership, because if the TVA builds solar panels, the TVA doesn't get those tax credits. So the TVA does not get that subsidy. And so either you're going to have public ownership and pricier energy, or you're going to have private ownership and cheaper energy. And so what the TVA actually does is it gets these small, small consumers or companies to build TVA that it buys the power from. But who's the people making the money from that, and who's the people making the decisions? It's capitalists. It's not us. It's not the public-owned TVA. And when I saw that the TVA does not get the same subsidies and they cannot offer solar power for the same price that a local capitalist can,
they're barred from doing it.
It's insane.
Right.
That's crazy.
And that's a federal carve out for the industry, is that the public sector cannot compete with private solar power. right? And that's, yeah, exactly. Like that's just an extremely dangerous precedent, and it's unnecessary. To be setting that up. And like, this is exactly like, the point that I've been trying to get. It's like, people sometimes have gotten mad at me, accusing me of now shilling for the oil industry, which is just ridiculous. Or being against like solar and wind. I'm not. But I am against importing the same kind of neoliberal model into, the way that we want to power society in the future, especially when we do have this great opportunity to do something different. Right. It's extremely frustrating. And, the way that I've been phrasing is that, like, for a long time, like the slogan on the left was like, believe the scientists. And then it was like climate action now. And I hate to be, this guy, but it's like, it actually also does really matter what that action looks like, because there is a neoliberal anti-worker way of doing it. I'm sorry to say it, but like we saw that, for example, in France, where they basically put, increasing gas taxes on workers. I mean, you're putting the costs of this, industry that has damaged the planet, and the kind of cleanup or, the cost of that on workers. And two, it makes this absurd calculation that I think Huber lays out really well in his books, Climate Change is Class War, and also in some pieces he's written at Jacobin and Catalyst, is that, there's also this kind of neoliberal fascination with market prices, whereas like if we get the right price for electricity and gasoline, then these systems will, sort of regulate it and fix themselves. And sorry, friends, like that, it ain't that easy. I mean, it's a really weird situation that we're in right now, because there is a significant investment in wind and solar from, the private sector. And we don't want to set up a system where we're relying on the same kinds of people, frankly, when we don't have to go down that path, and we could build something that works better for people.
Yeah, I think that's so important that we're going to go through energy transition. That's happening. It's going to continue to happen. But do we want to be stuck in this situation where the public depends upon energy, the environment will be impacted by this energy, but a handful of private interests are actually in charge, who own it, who control it, who profit from it? And I think that's the rub that, a lot of the conversations miss. Is oil is bad for the planet and for the climate. Yes, that's true, but it's not so much oil is not sentient, right? I mean, it's owned by human beings.
Right.
It's the private ownership of our energy system and the private ownership of the profits that come from that, and the power that they have over it. The power they have over our power. I mean, that's the fucking problem. And I think there is a way to address this in a different path forward of, and I say different, but really harken back to the TVA as an example. I like that you threw that in there, because we do need large-scale public power. Right. And we need to be able to go in good faith to folks who are coal miners or who are working on oil wells and say, we're not going to take your jobs. You're going to have jobs that'll actually be better. You should suffer no drop in your working conditions. You should not suffer a drop in your pay. You should be able to have a good union job moving forward. And we see that from time to time when we talk about the coal miner strike. And folks will just be like, oh, well, who gives a shit? They should just find a different job. Coal's going away. Well, that's not the answer. It's certainly not the answer if you're one of those miners. But it's really not the answer for any of us.
And like, I mean, I totally agree. And like, in the moral case is there, right? And like, there's two quick aspects. Like, there's the moral case. It's like, I don't know, not to get too rosy eyed about this, but like again, if we imagined that, for a second, where it wasn't true that, continuing to burn off fossil fuels was like harming the planet, right? These workers would be celebrated as the people who keep the lights on and like do like the most dangerous and necessary labor. And I think that, also having that respect is like, yes, the system is messed up. We want to move to using different kind of materials to power society. Like these people do incredibly socially necessary labor, right? So that's like the moral point. The political point is that a lot of people, and I think it's probably true in Alabama as it is in, other places where there's these kind of extractive industries, they blue collar working class folks, they look at these jobs as like really great ways out. Like if you don't have a lot of other options, like, and look, it doesn't even matter how true it is. It's like that mythology is just there. And that is why it does hold such a, it's such a powerful idea to sort of, keep voters in line with like Republican, it is why like Ted Cruz can do nothing for workers except say he's going to oppose, Green New Deal policies. Right. So what we need to be doing is providing a better vision because we can. That could create, a really huge swing in politics to our benefit. But that's the political and the moral case. This is like the technical case, too, that I think oftentimes gets understated and is a huge problem with the NGO and even a lot of like, left, socialist movement. Movements around, climate change, Green New Deal stuff, is that these are also workers who have these skills and know how to run a power system and know what is necessary. We should be wanting them, one, for the moral reason, for the political reason, but also because we actually like really need people with that kind of expertise and skill to be doing these kind of jobs in the future. I really like, some of the pushes that we've seen, particularly around like nuclear, where it's like there are a lot of one-to-one jobs that you can sort of transition some coal workers into doing, work with nuclear plants. And that's just one example, right? People who do power production across the board, like these people have expertise, one, just like on the technical, like mechanical side of like actually producing it, and two, of saying, this is what a power system needs to look like. And that's been unfortunately very absent, I think, in a lot of the movement, too, where it comes from very well-meaning folks who want to make a better world. But, you also sometimes you need to talk to the folks who like know what power production looks like, know what that responsibility feels like. If you want to be building plans, that makes sense. And, so unfortunately, I'm no expert on these kind of things. I rely on other folks. And I'm trying to humbly request other people do the same thing, frankly. Right. Is that a lot of the plans that we even see from like the left, unfortunately, have pretty apparent like fundamental issues with what that system would actually look like in practice. And the only way to get that kind of positive feedback or whatever is to be incorporating the labor movement and the experts into your policymaking instead of people who are coming out of, the NGO world, which has, a limited horizon in its understandings of a lot of these systems.
Yeah. And I think if your theory of change does not involve building worker power, what are you doing? Because, I think that's so important that the workers in these industries absolutely have to be involved in any of this policy discussion. And the more powerful they are, the better able we all are as a society to take on such a powerful industry. Because to your point earlier, I mean, the fossil fuel oligarchs are so powerful. Mm-hmm. I mean, it goes well beyond what most of us in most industries would even deal with, the power that they have on a truly global level. Right. These are folks who can overthrow governments and have.
Yeah.
So, if we're not actually building power at the point of production, we're already, outgunned and outmanned.
No, because that's the only force that's going to be able to, to shift them is like if the oil and gas workers are sort of shutting down production, for example, because we don't have the money to beat those guys, and unless we have a political power to do that, we'll be. I mean, Biden's been pretty whiny. I mean, I love the point that y'all are making, and I know that it was a call from USW too in the Beaumont lockout, is that the federal government should do no contracts with them until they end the lockout, right? And Biden sort of forgets and moves on. But like in that context, then it's like, okay, well, the only thing we can do is leverage that power, because we do need to decarbonize fast. And to meet that challenge, we need to have the most powerful weapon in our arsenal, which is, labor power.
Absolutely.
I mean, I do just want to say too that like there has been a really significant shift, I think, in one, like a lot of like labor movement folks and like labor movement affiliated organizations in trying to push for these kind of policies, which I think is very encouraging. I also think, as critical as I am of like the NGO left, that they have started to incorporate like calls for, things like worker justice. But I'd like that stuff to get a little bit more concrete than like, because they call for justice for a lot of things, and I don't doubt their sincerity, but it's just, it needs to be a bit more concrete if we want to actually utilize that power and effort.
Yep. Absolutely. David Griscom, the article is The Limits of Liberal Climate Policy in Jacobin Magazine. We appreciate your time, David. Is there anything else that you wanted to make sure that you hit on before you headed out?
No, check out the article, and you can always listen to me and Matt talking about the stuff on Left Reckoning. And I really appreciate, I always really appreciate being on here with y'all. The Valley Labor Report does incredible work. I always rep my hat proudly, y'all.
Thanks. We really appreciate it. And by the way, I really dug the Lenin letter to American workers video.
Oh, thank you.
Recently, that was pretty cool.
Yeah, that's a really fascinating one. I appreciate that.
Absolutely.
Oh yeah, and I enjoyed y'all's tribute to Michael Brooks, both on Left Reckoning and on the Majority Report. We actually, right after his passing, it motivated me to do a big special episode on Bolivia. We hired some translators. We talked to a 30-year coca grower, the president of the largest of the Labor Federation in the largest city in Bolivia, about the coup, about labor's response to the coup. We talked to some academics, some reporters from Bolivia, did a big thing about it, spent a lot of money. Spent a lot of money doing it, but I think it was worth it.
Totally. Oh, that's really wonderful to hear, y'all.
Yep.
All right, friends. Well, take care.
All right, brother. Yep. Have a good one. You just saw a clip from the Valley Labor Report. We are live every Saturday morning from 9:30 a.m. till 12:30 p.m. And we pride ourselves on keeping all of our content free to everybody so that we can talk to as many working folks as possible. If you support the work that we're doing, you think that it's important, you think that it's good, then consider making a monthly contribution to the project, and you can do that on our website, tvlr.fm.